The PS2 was the system where I really started to explore my own interests in the medium, with this being the first console I had where I was also earning a little bit of pocket money here and there, so every now and then I was able to buy myself a game instead of just relying on Christmas and birthday presents.
And eventually all of that led to a little game known as Bully. Except it's not called Bully here for some reason, but whatever. It's known as Bully elsewhere in the world, and trust me, that's what everyone here calls it anyway, so that's what I'm gonna carry on doing.
Whatever you want to call it, this game was everywhere at the time. It was a big deal, and I remember it well because I was around that age where I was still at school, so I wasn't really supposed to be playing Rockstar's more violent games. But in 2006, the Grand Theft Auto company put out a game that's kind of similar to those, but it was set within a school, and more importantly, it had a 15 age rating, which meant everyone got themselves a copy.
Anyway, while I wasn't originally planning on making a video about this one, it just kind of ended up happening really. You know, I was playing it for my own sake, and I got about 2 hours in when I thought to myself, you know what? This is pretty interesting. I could stand here and talk about it for a while, and while it's not what I would normally talk about, I just figured, whatever, it's my channel, you know, I can do whatever the hell I want. So I pressed restart, and then I pressed go on the capture card, and here we are.
But before we start this game up, let's just take a moment to appreciate the case here before us. You've got this nice and shiny embossed school logo on the front which stands out from the crowd, and on the inside we have this colour manual presented in the style of a school textbook, as well as a map of the game's town that doubles up as an art poster. Well, that last part should be in here anyway, but I must have lost it at some point. That's a shame. Oh, and one last thing before the game actually begins. The Rockstar Games logo. Yeah, you know me, I always love seeing this sort of thing, and Rockstar are usually pretty good at it, and this is no exception.
So, to start off with, while games like this from Rockstar typically work well because of a combination of the gameplay and the story, for the sake of this video, I've got to start somewhere, right? So for now, let's talk about the gameplay.
So, gameplay here is kind of what you'd expect from a Rockstar game from around this sort of time. There's a story going on within an open world map that you can make progress through by doing missions, and you'll start a mission by going to a character or a place marked on the map. Usually you'll have a conversation with somebody, and then you'll go off and do a bit of travelling, a bit of item collecting, some combat, or a bit of sneaking around, all sorts of things really. You'll also get some missions that take place within a unique location, or you'll have some sort of specific one-shot event that's made especially for that mission. I can't say a lot of this is anything mind-blowingly amazing in the moment, but combine it all with some excellent character interactions along the way, and I would say the entire game is greater than the sum of its parts. What can I say? It's a Grand Theft Auto styled game that released after the monumental success that was GTA 3, but it's for 15-year-olds. Obviously, with this being about a kid working his way through school, there's a lot less of the shooty gameplay of those games, and a lot more of this punchy gameplay. And for the hand-to-hand combat, despite me just saying nothing is amazing in the moment-to-moment gameplay, the exception to that might be this combat, because it's actually really good. A bit of it revolves around being a dirty fighter, using prank items like stink bombs, itching powder, marbles, or a slingshot to get an upper hand. But you can also just wail on people until they're weak enough to do a nasty finishing move. Obviously, it's not going to be anything fatal, but these are pretty harsh and basically act as a way of you humiliating your opponent enough to make them run away. You can slap dudes around the face, twist their arms, knee them in the balls, throw them into a trash can, and the worst one by far for me is just knocking someone over and spitting in their face. Later on in the game, you'll get some ranged weapons like the slingshot, a bottle rocket launcher, as well as this beastly looking potato bazooka which packs a serious punch. There's a lot of options here to fight dirty, which is definitely the best way to go in this game. Later on, you can be up against a lot of people in one fight, and yeah, you're kind of taught to use everything you have available to you. Once you unlock a few new combat moves, I'd say everything gels together really well. Health bars are always on display beneath your opponent's feet, which is pretty handy, and each group you fight against has their own music. In fact, that's something else I should mention while I'm here, because the soundtrack to this game is so good. There's a lot of bass guitar riffs combined with drums for some really catchy loops, along with instruments that you would find within a school, like xylophones, glockenspiels, and a whole bunch of percussion instruments to create a lot of mischievous sounding tracks, but also a lot of laid back and sneaky sounding ones. Everything you can do in this game has a cheeky little music track to go along with it, with a lot of musical variations for things like walking, running, being on a skateboard, getting into fights, you name it, pretty much everything is covered here. Each lesson has its own music, and a lot of missions have their own completely unique tracks as well. And for a nice change, I can actually use most of the soundtrack within this video because almost all of it is an original score. There's maybe some licensed tracks tucked away in really obscure and specific areas of the game, like apparently this track that plays in one of the clothing stores is just a distorted version of this music. I'm not going to play the original version here, but yeah, it's definitely that music. Anyway, at the very least you will probably have the bass line for the generic walking around theme in your head for years after your time at this academy. As for the open world, while the game is set within the town of Bulworth, to start off with, the game is dialed right the way back to just the school grounds, which, to be fair, that is still quite a wide open space that has a lot going on in and of itself. Missions will revolve around helping out students, as well as Jimmy, our main character here, getting himself known around the school. Speaking of which, because this is a school, you can also make Jimmy go to different classes twice a day. These are fairly basic minigames themed around whatever class is being taught at the time. Normally, I would hate this sort of thing, especially if it's forced onto you, but first of all, it's not forced onto you. Not really. If you can avoid being caught for truancy, then you don't have to attend these classes at all. But secondly, it's because, in fairness to them, every single one of these does give you a good reward that can help you out. You'll be able to use better verbal apologies and threats from the English classes, access to more items like the stink bombs and firecrackers from the chemistry classes, more combat moves and better projectile accuracy from the gym classes, and access to better BMX bikes from the shop classes. Maybe the photography class isn't as useful because you just unlock the option to save photos and fill the school yearbook, but even then that's maybe an activity for you to try and do after you complete the game, if you want to, I guess.
Fantastic!
Aside from that, none of the rewards here feel like a waste of time or effort, as they all have their genuine uses once you walk out of the classroom and back into the open world. Later on in the game, you can start knocking these lessons off your schedule entirely by finishing all instances of a subject, which acts as Jimmy completing the course and no longer needing to show up for those classes. Unless you really like doing them, I guess. I mean, you still have the option to go, but the whole reason I like these is because you get rewarded fairly for doing them, so without the rewards, it's just... yeah, I don't know, it just seems pretty pointless really. I don't know why anybody would do these. Once you start Chapter 2, the school gates are opened, allowing access to a fair amount of the surrounding town for a lot more room to explore. None of it feels overwhelming or forced into your face though, it's just now you have access to a lot more variety in the things you can see and do when not in a mission. You can go to different stores to get haircuts and clothing, which is usually needed to better fit into the different groups around the school. It's not that important or anything, but I thought this fancy haircut that was needed for this one specific mission actually looked pretty good on Jimbo, so I just left it there for the entirety of my playthrough. Then you've got bike races that you can compete in, which actually end up getting easier the more you complete the shop classes thanks to the BMX upgrades. There's also boxing matches, and even a fully playable funfair area with rides and games to play, including a go-kart track, which is fun. It all just feels pretty natural, you know, everything is where you would expect to find it, operating in the way you would if you just think about things normally. You know, the man in the shop will sell you the things for the money, the lady at the fun fair will let you hit the target with a big hammer, the man in the bicycle shop will sell you bicycle. You know, just go where you would expect to find things and you'll probably find them. You'll occasionally have people asking Jimmy for help with small errands that are completely separate from the entire main and side mission structure, which I know became more of a thing as time went on with other Rockstar games, because I remember Red Dead Redemption 2 went wild with this sort of thing, so it's kind of interesting to see an early version of that here. But yeah, overall I would say the entire game world of Bullworth is just really natural feeling. It's big enough to have variety in its districts like the poor and rich areas of town, as well as the industrial estate and the dockyards. But before all of that, when you're still within the school grounds, even then that's still a pretty decent area to explore, and you're given a skateboard fairly early on to get around it quicker before the bikes become more useful once things do open up in Chapter 2. The skateboard is still pretty cool though, I'm not gonna lie. Honestly, I think Bullworth is the perfect size for what it is. The town is small and tailor-made with very little in the way of copy and pasted areas, with a lot of landmarks to pretty easily learn the layout of this place over time. I think a testament to that is that the further I got into this game, the less I needed to rely on looking at the minimap in the corner to know where I needed to go. Anytime a basic description is given, that was usually enough for me to mentally picture it and get moving, including some of the shortcuts I learned by just playing through the missions that made use of them. And this level of purely memory-driven navigation is something I can't really say about most other open world games that I've played before or since this one. You know, a lot of open world games are either these massive, super condensed grid-like cityscapes, or these huge open areas with landmarks spread so far apart that I can't really relate to anything, and either which way I end up relying on a map or a radar the entire time. Like here, for instance, I could not tell you where I'm standing in Liberty City from just looking around. I have no idea where I am, look at this! I am the needle in the haystack. The only way to really bypass this feeling from my experience is to be playing as somebody that can travel so quickly that it doesn't matter if the cityscape feels like a maze, because that is a problem for the little people down there, not me. But here with Bullworth, it's the fact this entire town goes against that feeling, and navigating this place as one of those little guys feels pretty comfortable. Outside of maybe a few of the streets in the industrial estate, which is the last area you unlock, meaning I spent less time there to learn its layout anyway, I generally know where I am by just being there, using my eyes and looking around. And even then, if I'm not sure, I'm never that far away from an identifiable landmark for me to get my bearings. Everything about this town, with its theming, the size, the places you can go within it, even where the collectibles are placed for you to find, it all really works as this big, but not too big, living and breathing place, and so the town itself is a pretty big highlight of this game for me. Seriously, this is one of the best open world maps I've ever played around in. The only time things in this world seem obviously video gamey is with how much money you get for doing almost anything during your time here, and how a lot of this stuff you can buy is really easy to find for free by, you know, just playing the game. And this kind of breaks the economy fairly early on, so you end up with a lot of money going spare once things get moving into the wider town after you start Chapter 2. The further things go on, the more money you'll have sitting there doing nothing. This is actually something I found to be a problem for me with most other open world Rockstar games, but it's especially the case here. And it's because while things like haircuts and new clothing do cost money, I just never felt the need to do any of that too often outside of the times it's forced onto you, which by the way, isn't that often at all. Like I said, I only changed Jimmy's hairstyle one time throughout the entire game, so that's a grand total of $15 spent on haircuts for my entire playthrough. And I didn't change his clothes all that much because you'll just end up getting hassled for breaking the school's dress code if you wear anything other than the stuff they provide you. So, thanks for saving me the stress and money, I guess? Anything else that would seem like an obvious way to spend cash here, I just didn't really see the point. Any supplies that you use for makeshift weapons like eggs, stink bombs, and itching powder, you can gradually earn a free stash of these in the dorm room by just progressing through the various classes and missions. And things like the boxes of chocolates or flowers that Jimmy uses to impress the ladies, well, they both cost money in the shop, but you can pick flowers for free from all sorts of places, so I never bought any of those. Then there's also the bike shop, which has some fancy looking bicycles for you to buy, but the shop class gradually gives you access to way better BMX bikes than anything this place can offer, so I didn't buy anything from here either. The fact I was able to wipe the floor with everybody else in a late game bike race while they were using the expensive ones from the shop proves my point. I got this bike for free and I'm doing fine. So I pretty much went the entire game without buying anything, save for the occasional soda from vending machines for extra health, but again, and you've probably guessed what I'm about to say, you can find a lot of those on anyone you defeat in a fight anyway, which happens quite often, so you don't even need to buy those most of the time either. The only time something being given away for free that makes long-term sense to me is this, a very simple, free-to-use, one-way fast travel back to the school grounds by using the school bus. This makes it easier to balance exploring the town while still being in a position to attend a few of those classes, especially later on in the game when a lot of missions take place further and further away from the school. All of that is still very much doable if you skip the classes, but like I said earlier on, those classes are worth doing, so having the option of a quick way to get back to campus to do these classes is a good thing, and it being free checks out because it's a school bus that's provided by the school. In fact, while I'm here talking about the game world and its immersion, if I had to point out one thing that I do find a bit odd that does take me out of it from time to time, it would be how the camera works when you try and turn it around whilst moving Jimmy. It's kinda hard to explain, but this is not like most other games where you just move the character in relation to the camera. Here, it's totally dependent on which way Jimmy is facing, but that only applies after you've already started to make him move. It's really weird, and it doesn't affect things too often, but this is something I've always noticed about this game ever since I first played it. It's not a big problem, but it is one I feel I should mention while I'm here because this thing has bugged me for so long now. If you ever get around to playing this for yourself or go back to it to play it again, just try and make Jimmy move around whilst turning the camera and you'll see exactly what I mean. Like the other Rockstar games I've played, I would say the story and the characters here are pretty good. Maybe not as focused in the sense that you are often dipping in and out of the various social groups, as well as helping out some of the adults around town, but it does all come together by the end, and these characters really help sell it. Jimmy Hopkins himself is actually a great main character. At first, we're under the impression that he's a bit of a bonehead, constantly wrecking up schools and generally being a little shit everywhere he goes, kicked away from his mother and forced aboard at Bulworth Academy simply to keep him out of trouble. But actually, as the game goes on, I would say he has a pretty level head on his shoulders for the most part. He basically has a low bullshit threshold, so he's pretty quick to call people out if he feels like he's being messed around with.
That is not the Bulworth way, boy.
Yeah, you could have fooled me.
What?
I said you could have fooled me. This place is full of bullies and maniacs.
Nonsense!
At least as far as the story goes anyway. I mean, you can make Jimmy wreck the school and act like a little shit if you want to, but that's on you. But yeah, overall, I do like this guy. He's pretty quick-witted and fast to take people up on work if he knows it will also benefit him, but he's also willing to help people out if they're genuinely upset and look like they really need the help. The only real flaws with his character were during the opening and closing chapters of the game. Without spoiling too much for anyone that somehow still hasn't played Bully, the opening chapter has Jimmy make friends with a shy kid named Pete and this absolute maniac of a human being named Gary, who ends up being a massive shit stirrer and causes a lot of grief for both Jimmy and Pete throughout the entire game. And despite Gary giving off some majorly bad vibes, Jimmy does not see any of this coming. Come on, Jimbo, Gary here is like the human embodiment of a massive red flag. He's also a way bigger dickhead than some of the other people you call bullshit on later in the game, so I have no idea why Jimmy fell for any of this. There are a few times where he's basically tricked into doing things for other people, which is maybe Jimmy being a bit naive. After all, he did start this school fairly late and he doesn't know anybody, so he doesn't know who to trust. But he does spend a lot of time with Gary at the start of the game, and I don't know about you, but I think my spider sense would have been going off like crazy around this guy because his behavior is just unhinged.
Anyway, I've got a good idea for some fun. Let's go out and torment someone really helpless and unfortunate.
Spider sense tingling.
The other bit I'm not too keen on is how quickly Jimmy develops a god complex over his peers once he does in fact become the popular kid. You know, this is after an entire game of him literally smacking that attitude out of other people, and then he just goes and does it himself, and it seems really out of character. I do get why this was done though. It's all part of that up and down roller coaster redemption character arc that this entire game has going on. And of course, the name of the chapter is literally The Rise and Fall of Jimmy Hopkins, so it's not that unexpected. But you know how it goes, video game is gonna make you feel the way video game wants to make you feel. We've just stopped a load of people from being dickheads to one another, and now the guy we've been rooting for this whole time has become the biggest dickhead of them all. Thankfully, this doesn't last very long, and the game ends off with him genuinely being the bigger and better man, with Gary getting his comeuppance and Jimmy becoming the popular but still level-headed kid he should have been in the first place. It's a genuinely good character arc for Jimmy, and the journey he goes through to reach that point, with him working his way through each social group and solving the problems they have with one another, is full of character. That's basically the entire point of the game really, with Jimmy trying to stop each group from bullying everybody else all the time by knocking heads together along the way. Say what you will about his methods, but behind the occasional violence and aggression, you can easily see that he's after the right thing here. Even outside of his classmates, this guy goes out of his way to stick up for a teacher who's being bullied by another teacher, as well as this girl that was wrongly kicked out of school before Jimmy showed up thanks to another teacher being a dickhead. There's a lot of depth to Jimmy's character, and I guess his development here is a sort of reflection of what he wants from everybody else around him, not to judge people at face value. I mean, think about it, the opening of this game paints Jimmy in a pretty bad light as this kid with a rough upbringing that just causes chaos everywhere he goes, but it actually doesn't take that long for him to seem like he's the only sane person in the entire school. Along the way, you will meet up with pretty much every character in the academy and beyond, with each chapter being dedicated to taking down one group, with the seasons gradually changing to reflect the passage of time throughout the school year. Because of this, you'll also get things like Halloween and Christmas happening fairly early on, which is nice to see, and the change is reflected with different weather patterns and a lot of snow in the winter that affects the ground movement. It is a shame they never went any further with this idea, as I feel like it's just winter and Halloween that get properly represented, and I'm mainly saying that because I do like autumn. The only exception to the story structure here is that the jocks and the nerds don't get their own dedicated story chapters, instead sharing one towards the end of the game where Jimmy initially takes on the nerds and then convinces them to team up and take on the jocks on their home turf. While I did enjoy this chapter overall, I do feel like the jocks get shafted here as that group that gets rushed out of the door so the game can get to its concluding chapter, as the nerds get more time on screen throughout the game, especially early on, as Jimmy does help a few of them out not long after he arrives at Bulworth, which leaves the jocks mainly just having the last couple of missions of this chapter to be in the spotlight, which it's not very long. Maybe there's only so much you can do when these guys don't exactly make plans of their own for Jimmy to go up against, but the fight against the nerds more than makes up for that. Either which way, each chapter throughout the game kind of ends up feeling like its own little story, with the background detail of Gary causing problems for Jimmy only really showing up a handful of times in between the first and final chapters, which I do find a bit odd. I mean, think about it, Gary either lives within the same dorm room as Jimmy or within the town of Bulworth, so it's pretty weird that you basically never see this guy once that opening chapter is out of the way, save for a couple of occasions within missions right up until until the very end. And Gary himself is also extremely one-dimensional once that initial betrayal happens, so he's not even that good of a villain when he's revealed to be one. But there's plenty of other characters to see and talk to, and it's kind of surprising just how many of them get their time in the spotlight here. Not only the students, but the teachers, and even a few of the shopkeepers around town have properly animated cutscenes and voice acting for when you meet them. Yeah, this is Rockstar after they made Grand Theft Auto 3 after all, so there's a lot of memorable characters within this game. You've got Pete and Gary being polar opposites of one another, all of the students from all of the different social groups, which are the obvious stereotypes that you've seen in every movie about schools ever. You've got the nerdy dorky kids, the preppy rich douchebag kids, the greased up wannabe cool kids, and the roided up meatheads. Not to mention the countless other kids that aren't really in any of those groups that you'll just see roaming around and appearing in side missions. Then there's the oblivious head teacher, Dr. Crabblesnitch, along with his snooty secretary, the cafeteria cook who has absolutely no sense of food hygiene, the alcoholic English teacher, Mr. Galloway, and the art teacher, Miss Phillips, who likes him and wants to help him out. This random biology teacher who's pissed off that some kid's dad also owns the same rare plant as him. The dick-headed gym teacher, Mr. Burton, who likes to bully kids and also,
Evening, sir.
You, boy! What do you think you're doing?
Nothing. What about you?
Well, I'm looking for naughty boys. I mean, I'm looking for naughty boys in the wrong parts of town.
The owners of the bike shop and comic book shop who both see their fair share of troubled customers, and this crazy homeless guy that lives on the school grounds who teaches Jimmy some of his old army combat moves. I'm sure I'm missing a few, but straight away from what I've just said alone, that's already a lot of unique and fairly memorable characters. It just goes to show that even though it's been well over 15 years since my last playthrough of this game, even now I was still occasionally remembering what the characters were about to do at times during the story, and how they acted towards Jimmy. Even some of the random dialogue that comes out of NPCs when roaming around the school in between missions. It's surprising how much of it was still lodged somewhere in the back of my brain after all this time. Aside from one or two hiccups, the cast of characters here are fairly well realised and memorable, which is great. Seriously, you meet so many of the characters here on multiple occasions, and Jimmy's efforts of just trying to stop everybody from being a dickhead to each other all the time makes him a pretty good anchor point for the entire narrative.
But for all of these characters and the open world around you, I think some of the best stuff happens when you, as the player, slow down, take a step back, and just observe what's going on around you, because it can be pretty interesting.
It won't take long for you to notice that all NPCs in the school, and even a few from beyond the academy gates, are genuinely unique characters, all with their own names, personalities, voiced lines, and they constantly mess around with each other. Obviously, you'll see a lot of them in missions and cutscenes throughout the story, but it's just impressive to see this stuff happening during the downtime in between missions. NPCs roaming around, picking on each other, playing pranks, and physically retaliating to anybody that wrongs them. You can even slap a kick me sign on the back of somebody just to watch the chaos of everybody else around you doing exactly what it says. Sure, you can do all of these things yourself too, but it's fun to be a passive observer and just see how dynamic all of this is. It is pretty impressive for the time, and it may well be one of the first games I played that has this sort of natural feel to the random characters populating a game world. It really feels like a cauldron of aggression that would be bubbling away even if I wasn't here, but it's funnier that I am, so I can see all of this stuff happening. It's also just sort of interesting to see ideas here that went on to become much bigger parts of much bigger Rockstar games later on. Things like these side missions popping up, where an NPC will approach Jimmy with a problem that needs dealing with. These can just sort of happen anywhere really, and while it's a little bit more video gamey here, actually being given the objective on screen and then having the errand complete text pop up afterwards, I remember Red Dead Redemption 2 taking that idea and making it way more diegetic, and here we have what seems to be an early version of that idea, which is pretty cool to see how that came about. But outside of being a passive observer, if you do want to make your presence known, well, That can be pretty interesting too. Another mechanic you have available to you at all times is being able to just go up to somebody and talk to them. You can make Jimmy say something nice or flirtatious, or make a snide comment, and depending on how things go, these can escalate into full-blown arguments, apologies, shoving people around, physical threats, and context-sensitive attacks. So with all of these things combined, I don't know, there's just something special going on here. It's that feeling of this entire game world being alive and bustling with activity even without the player's input that is really cool to witness at times. But when you do feel like getting involved, it's like throwing a Mento into a Coke bottle, especially early on in the game when nobody knows who Jimmy is. I know I keep going on about it, but I can't not give this game praise for how alive it all feels. There's always something going on, especially around the school grounds. The only downside is that once you finish the story and everybody really likes Jimmy, it's a lot harder to make these kind of situations happen. You can go right up to people, shove them around, call them names, or even punch them straight in the face, and a lot of the time either nothing will happen or the other person will just run away. And yeah, I get that maybe this is the reward for finishing the game and becoming the popular kid, but I can't help but be a little bit disappointed. I want to see that cauldron of aggression bubble over and chaos erupt before my eyes every now and then, you know? But it's just a lot harder to do once you finish the game.
And so, now it's time for me to talk about what happens towards the end of this game, as well as some of the stuff you can do once you're done with the story, but I wouldn't worry too much about spoilers here, both with this video and with the game itself.
Yeah, so I am going to be talking about the ending here, but I feel like the journey towards that ending, all the way from the very start, is a lot better and a lot more fun to see unfold than anything this final portion of the game can offer up. Skip on ahead a bit if you really want to, but I think this is definitely one of those games that's more about the journey than the destination, if you get what I mean. The ending isn't outright bad or anything, but I would say things generally wrap up in a way you would mostly expect based on how the first couple of chapters go, with Jimmy gradually working his way back up the social ladder just for things to look peachy before everything falls apart, leaving room for one last round of vengeance. There's some good moments for Jimbo in here along the way for sure. Betrayal, redemption, some quick wit and fast thinking, and genuinely making good on the people that have helped him out along the way, as well as finally confronting Gary and showing him up for the no-good little shit stirrer that he is. Overall, I think the ending is good, but it just can't hold a candle to the entire journey Jimmy goes through in order to reach it, with all of these different characters clashing against one another, and Jimmy being at the center of it all, just trying to bring the school a bit closer together. And in a way, for me, it's a bit of a parallel between the game and the real world, because it's like I said at the start of this video, bully was a big deal, and it was a big deal in my school. I guess you could say I was one of the nerdy kids when I was at school. Maybe not as nerdy as the nerds in this game. Friggin' dorks. But you know, I would hang around with my friends who also played video games, which back then it was considered to be kind of nerdy to do that. But then along comes this game, and everyone bought themselves a copy. We were all hanging around at break time talking about Bully for a few weeks, and it was interesting hearing about it from people I didn't usually speak to all that much. And I think Jimmy Hopkins himself would be pretty happy knowing it was all his doing. Anyway, once the school term is over, it's time for the Endless Summer chapter, which is this game's way of letting you do whatever you want. Go around and finish any odd jobs you missed out on, find some collectibles, compete in races, whatever you like. You are still in a position to complete any classes you missed the rewards for, and there's some secrets to find by grinding out certain challenges like the funfair games, go-kart tracks, and bike races, but by this point, you can mostly call it a day unless you want to go for full completion. You see, those rewards you get for completing the classes, they are useful, but not that useful if you've already finished the main story, and completing any jobs for even more money seems a bit pointless when you run out of things you actually need to buy. Sure, you can go and buy some haircuts and clothing if you really want to, but I don't really know why you would want to. And I guess that brings me to a few smaller criticisms I have with this game, with the first one being that for as great as that story is, once it's over, it kind of feels like the game has packed up its stuff and walked out on you. That's not to say there's literally nothing to do here, but a lot of it does boil down to you finding your own fun, which isn't for everybody, so your mileage may vary. Another downside to finishing the story is just that, not being able to replay any of these excellent story missions without having to replay the entire game all over again up until that point. Unless, of course, you have the miraculous foresight to make a separate save slot for some of the more memorable missions. But, of course, you wouldn't know which ones are the more memorable missions until it's too late. Like this one that takes place on Halloween night, where you dress up and play pranks on other students and teachers. I'd love to replay this one from time to time. The change of decoration and the fun spooky vibes you get with everybody all dressed up in costumes for the occasion is really nice. But there's no way to do that without making a fresh save and starting all over again, which is a shame. And as mentioned earlier on, the economy here is kind of broken, with a lot of items you'd normally need to pay for being made available for free elsewhere. Maybe half of that can be chalked up to rewarding players for putting the time and effort into knowing where to look, but that doesn't sit too well with me, especially the flowers. I mean, look how easy it is to get these things. Aside from that, I don't have a lot of bad things to say about this one. I guess going back to the old Rockstar Games format of starting the mission over again from the beginning and travelling all the way back to the mission giver if you fail is a little old hat by now, but that only ended up happening to me twice here, so it's not that big of an issue. Overall, I would say this game isn't that difficult, and I can't really point out any missions that would be a total difficulty spike roadblock for new players. You know, you're not going to be making CJ follow any damn trains here. But revisiting Bully after however many open world games have happened since then, the lack of any major criticisms from me kinda speaks for itself, really. This is a very tightly made open world game with a lot of character, a lot of charm, and very little in the way of unused spaces and ideas. The town of Bulworth on its own, outside of doing any of the main story missions, has so much to see and do, with it feeling like a real place with real people going about their day-to-day lives. The story is also really good, with some fun characters to get to know, and when things get rough, the hand-to-hand combat system is really fun to get to grips with too. What else can I say? I know I played this game before years ago, and I remembered liking it back then, but this has aged like a fine wine. I often shrug off or get bored halfway through open world games these days, but going back to this one, there was no chance of that happening. There's just way too much to like here, and the fact it constantly has stuff going on, bubbling away in the downtime between the bigger, more scripted sequences, made a lot of the game fun to just be a part of. Anyway, if you wanted to play this one, there's a handful of different ways to do it, including the original PS2 release, along with remasters, re-releases, and ports, which all vary in quality and functionality from what I can tell. I'll start off with the version I played to gather footage for this video, the emulated PS4 re-release being played on a PS5, which is not great. When played this way, the game does stutter quite a lot, there's the occasional audio glitch here and there, and the funfair area really makes it struggle to function at all for some reason, so maybe don't play this version if you have the choice. I got through it just fine for the most part, and it's okay, but it's by no means great. It does have trophies though, if you care about that sort of thing. Then you've got the PC release, which is still available to play through Steam, but it basically doesn't work without extensive modding, so I wouldn't even bother with that myself. Any other versions have minor issues here and there, but nothing game-breaking as far as I know, and of course the Wii version has some motion controls thrown in, but I think that's to be expected really. You are probably best sticking with the original PS2 version in my opinion, and in this day and age, you don't necessarily need a PS2 in order to do that, so do what you will with that information.
But if we just ignore any other ports and talk about the game itself for a second, I can't stand here and say it's perfect, but I can say it's very good, and in fact, it feels like it's a bit of a masterclass in this specific style of game that Rockstar really pioneered back in their day. But it's also a game from a much simpler time, back when a game only had to be as good as the piece of physical media that was printed on the disc.
These days, a lot of companies are chasing after the evergreen product. You know, something that can still earn more and more money as time goes on. And with Rockstar, you already know what I'm talking about. GTA Online. That thing is the main reason we have Grand Theft Auto 5 available on 3 different generations of console. I mean, it would have sold well on its own anyway, no doubt about it, but yeah, they've just got to keep that microtransaction money pit open if people are still willing to throw cash down it. But I don't have a problem with people enjoying GTA Online. It's not totally my kind of thing, but I do get why people play it. It's a bit of fun after all, but it's proof that times have changed, and for Rockstar at least, a game like Bully has mostly been swept under the rug.
Either which way, Bully is a fantastic game, there's no doubt about that, but with this specific style of game and everything it does as the product in your hand, well, that isn't as important to Rockstar as it once was, because now it's all about the things they can add in after the game launches, which leaves something like this as a freebie. They just dish out to make their subscription services look a little bit better, and that's a shame, because I really do feel like this is definitely worth your time. This is a great game. As for me, well, I've obviously got plenty of other things to play, but should I wish to revisit Rockstar Games on this channel in the future, I might just have to swap out that blue mood lighting for a bit of red, if you know what I mean, but until then, I'll catch you next time.